Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Vissolela, who's a member of the African community in Melbourne. Thanks for coming in, Vissolela.
You're welcome.
Your background, to start with, you were born in Angola.
Yes.
And you left there when you were about 8 months old, is that right?
That's correct.
And that was because of the conflict there?
That's right. It was because of the civil war that started in 1975.
Then you went from there to Zambia.
Yes.
What happened there?
Basically, what happened was, I guess my memories of Africa are all of Zambia, because that's where I remember the most. I mean, having left at 8 months, I had no memory of what what life was like in Angola. So all I remember of Zambia is living there and growing up. I went to school there. I ate, I slept, I had friends, and obviously I remember being aware of the fact that I was, a refugee from across the border, because I spoke Portuguese and I spoke English at the same time. And I guess culturally we're slightly different from, the people in the Zambian population. So those were my memories.
You described the situation in Zambia as being very transient because of the neighbouring countries?
Yes, Zambia is a very interesting country if you look at it geographically, where it's located. And if you look back at the time that I was there, 1986, there were a lot of conflicts around all the countries that Zambia basically borders with. When you think of the Congo, I mean, obviously there's still a little bit of conflict there now, so that borders with Zambia as well. And you had Angola, which is where I come from. There was a civil war. And across on the other side, there's Mozambique. There was a civil war. Malawi, there was a civil war. Even countries just a little bit farther up, Tanzania, there were a little bit of unease there as well. And I also remember growing up or meeting people from Uganda, which again is close to Tanzania. And again, there was a civil war there as well. Going south, you had the apartheid movement in South Africa. So there were a lot of also South Africans who, part of the ANC, who had moved into the country to escape, obviously, apartheid and prosecution from the apartheid movement. But you also had people from Namibia who had also left Namibia because of the apartheid movement and had somehow found themselves in Zambia, again, escaping persecution.
So it was a real melting pot. What did it look like? You were only young, of course, but you would have been mixing with people from a lot of different countries. And I
feel very fortunate, because I think I met a lot of the very idealistic Africans, because they were the people who were at the forefront of a lot of the movements that then, unfortunately, the negative side of it is obviously the civil war, the ugliness, but no one actually ever looks at the positive side, that these people were trying to get change because they didn't have change. Nowadays we look at South Africa and we obviously praise Mandela and say, oh great, look at what the ANC has done, look at Mandela has led the ANC through this political change. But there were a lot of other countries in Africa where the same thing was occurring at the same time, whereas they literally have not received the same kind of praise as South Africa has gotten for changing the political dialogue that existed there since the beginning of colonialization. Angola was affected by the same thing, even longer than South Africa was, for about 500 years. I mean, that's one thing that people don't historically look at. Namibia, through South Africa, also the Dutch, they were also affected by the same thing. So there were a lot of very young, idealistic revolutionists, intelligent, they had studied either overseas or through, some of them had studied at the top universities overseas or even in the top universities in their own country. And those were the people that, as a child, I was accustomed to associating with.
So it was a pretty exciting environment, really, environment of change.
Well, yes, at the time it was a very environment of change. Now, I know when people ask me about, what was it like, I guess they're expecting a rather, oh, it was terrible, it was hard, or this and that. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how those people survived or what they did or whether did they kill, did they do this or whatever. That's actually was never relevant to me. My relationship with them was as a child. They were always very polite, very nice to me. They never seemed miserable or unhappy, regardless of whatever the situations that they were going through. I remember some of, I guess, my mother's and father's friends who were from South Africa. Obviously, they've been basically running away from the apartheid movement.
Yes.
So I'm guessing they would have had a lot of side issues there. But from my perspective, they always looked happy, There's always about, there you are, greetings. We used to eat together, talk, and I commend my parents for having kept me, I guess, sheltered from whatever might have been going on, but I never got a sense of any problems.
So your experience at that point of Africa was reasonably positive. It was nothing.
No, I don't remember having any negative or hating it or thinking that, God, I can't wait to get out of here. Obviously I was aware that I was living in someone else's country, which was pointed out to me, by the locals. But it wasn't. I never felt like I was in any physical danger. Right. It was the fact that I was in the wrong place, and in 1986 the war in Angola had probably been going on for almost 11 years, and it ended up going on for maybe another 11, so that would have been, the war went on for about 27 years. Right. So that's another 12
or so
12 years. Yeah. No, actually more than 12. That would have been 15 years, or 16 years. Yeah. So it went on for another 16 years from the time that I left. So basically from, I guess I'm trying to extrapolate from my mother's perspective, not knowing when the war would end or when we would go back, I guess there's a sense of limbo.
Yes.
Of just, you don't know what the future is going to be like. So ideally, I think we would have liked to have gone back, but that wasn't actually a choice at the time.
Didn't happen.
No.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about you coming to Australia.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Vissolela, and she's an African resident in Melbourne. You then left Zambia for Australia, and you came as a refugee family. What was that like, arriving as a refugee family? What was the story? Well,
at the time I didn't think, when I first left Africa or Zambia, getting on the plane, I thought nothing of it. It was just like we were moving from another town to another town. I'd never heard anything about Australia. I had no idea where Australia was. I had no idea what language I guess I got told they spoke English in Australia. Obviously that wasn't going to be a problem because I'd been speaking English since I started speaking. So when I started speaking, I could speak Portuguese and English at the same time, and I'd picked up 3 or 4 other African languages just from moving around the country. So I really, as a 9-year-old, really didn't think I had any issues, any problems that I had to worry about. I was a little bit upset that I was leaving my friends behind again. And I guess when you're moving around as much as we did, you were always leaving something behind. So that, wasn't something I was basically looking forward to. I didn't really think of the kind of friends I was going to make. Didn't bother me. I guess I was getting older and starting to form physical attachments, or at least physical attachments to friendships. And anyway, so when we arrived, we actually came here via Perth, Sydney, Melbourne. I remember it being colder than I imagined it was going to be. You know, they told us it was summer. We arrived here in November. That was going to be really warm. Instead, it was like cold. So we actually, weren't prepared for the climate. And unfortunately, we weren't prepared for a lot of the other things that we were told were going to be, but didn't happen. So unfortunately, our expectations that, you know, once we came into Australia, all our lives were going to be like easy and better. You know, that was one of the misconceptions that I think my parents had, and in essence myself. So what happened instead is realizing just how hard they would have had to work just to, I guess, maintain the basic our basic needs, which they did. Well, you know, they weren't complaining, but it was the assumption that my mother, who was a teacher, and my father then, who had a business degree, they thought they were able to continue their careers, but that was actually, they didn't have those opportunities to do so. So they had a choice of either work in a factory, or your degree is invalid here, or go back to university. And with 4 kids, that's obviously not an option that you're going to consider.
No. What we were discussing earlier, we were talking about the tragedy of being a refugee.
Yes.
You made an interesting point about what you think the tragedy is of being a refugee.
Yes, well, whenever I meet people, they always ask me, "Oh, what was it like? Was it terrible? You know, how, you know, being a refugee?" And one of the things I always tell them is that my life changed not when I came to Australia, because they want this happy ending story about, oh, you come to Australia and your whole life is like just starts over. But for me, the tragedy has been the change for me began when I first left my country.
Yes.
Whether I was aware of it or not, it didn't matter. But once I left, it meant everything else that happened to me was a result of my leaving. Having to migrate to Australia was a result of my leaving Angola in the first place.
Yes.
And that was a result of the Civil War, which, like I mentioned to you before, was also a fallout of the Cold War between the US and Russia. I mean, no one ever talks about it. I try to, you know, as we were discussing it before, it was never a result of religious reasons, or the divisions within the country were not religious. They weren't because of tribal, as it's often referred to, that in Africa it's all about, the conflicts are all about tribal warfare.
Yeah.
Was never that. It was all about ideology. And those ideologies that people strongly believed in terms of the direction that they felt they wanted Africa to go to in the future, is what kept them divided. And on top of that, we have the US on one hand and Russia on the other hand, influencing different political parties and also political ideologies, and fueling it. We had the Cubans who were in Angola for for 27 years.
Yes.
They fought the war on the side of the current political party that's in power. And Reagan gave us a lot of money to the other opposition side, over 21 million, to buy arms at the time. So this is what made the war continue on for as long as it did.
So it goes on, and there was you also mentioned it as a young child, and there's a lot of migrant children. I would call them migrant children rather than refugees, but refugees as well, who come at about 7, 8, 9 years old. Now, you mentioned something about having a little bit of an angst. Angst, yes.
And I feel very angry. I feel angry that I had to leave the country that I was born in, that I never got the opportunity to grow up there. And that anger, we were talking before about where it's directed. And for me, I can't direct it at my parents, because they did what they thought was best for me. And so it's almost that you direct it to, you try to basically make sense of it. And then whose fault is it? Yeah. And then you look at people like the US, and you look at, you know, the Cold War, you look at Russia, and you look at, you know, at the end of the day, they're the ones who kept the war going for as long as it did. So my anger, unfortunately, is directed at a lot of the colonial powers at the time that were actually manipulating and controlling the situation. And I feel more like a victim of the
Cold War.
Cold War,
Yes.
more than, a victim of a civil war.
And as a child, when you move from some place like that, you're not the decision maker.
No, I wasn't the decision maker, and there was a sense of I felt like a suitcase when we left. And when I first said to you why I had no emotions landing in Australia. It was simply, we're going to this country, it's meant to be better for us. I went, okay, well, that's fine. I was never asked for my opinion, what I thought of it, whether I wanted to come. And when I got here, the reality of it for me was completely different to the reality for my parents. I remember growing up, I was happy. I didn't have any problems with the people around me. So coming here, I had a completely different kettle of fish to deal with, Well,
we'll deal with that kettle of fish in a moment because we're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity, and we're speaking with Vissolela, who's a member of the African community in Melbourne. Now, arriving here, a little African girl, 9 years old, into school. What was that like? What was schooling like? What happened there?
It was a shock to the system, and not in the way that a lot of people would think. It wasn't it wasn't an academic challenge. The schools that I came from were more than adequate in terms of teaching me everything I needed to know up to the level that I was at. It was the shock was how I was then treated and referred to as an African person. Before I came here, I never thought of myself as black. My identity was around my nationality and my family. But when I crossed into Australia, all that got washed away. My nationality was no longer an issue, or it was no longer given significance. And I was given a sense of self-pride from my parents about being Angolan and being strong and fighting for your rights, as obviously that's why we ended up in a war for 27 years, a civil war, because everyone has very strong sense of who they are. And coming here, I got reduced to someone who was just black. And where I don't have a problem with being black, obviously I am black, but it's not what defines me as a person. It wasn't what defined me as a 9-year-old, and it still isn't what defines me now. What I found was people had very negative stereotypes of Africans that I previously wasn't aware existed. Things around people, just a lot of the children, around the same age as me, would avoid me for as much as they could. Whenever it came to group activities in class, they would pick me being the last person, and the only reason that they gave was basically I was black, and they felt that in their minds as a black person I had to be treated a certain way, and that would be the last person to be picked because I wasn't as good as they were. They had this belief in their heads that they were better than I was, simply based on their skin color, and as an inferior person I had to be treated as such. And there was one particular girl who kind of led the vendetta or the charge against making sure that my place at the bottom of the pecking order was maintained. She would basically do things like, if someone even made a point of picking me before someone else, she would point it out that no, she needs to go down here because you're not picking her, are you? She's black, you're not picking her. We pick her last. So those things were the environment that I actually, I had to psychologically adjust to.
Right.
And that obviously created a greater sense of social isolation, because I immediately had to deal with the fact that people didn't like me, not because I was Angolan anymore, but because I was actually physically black. And that was something I had no power over.
Right.
Yeah, it was that I didn't feel powerless, but it was the sense of like, oh, okay, this is interesting. I never thought this was ever a problem. And along with the stereotypes of people didn't expect me to be very smart. When I first came here, they put me in an English speaking group because they felt that my English, for whatever reason, wasn't as good as the other students. And strangely enough, I didn't last in that group because my English wasn't a problem. At that point, I was actually speaking 4 languages. I was obviously more linguistically advanced than any of the kids in the school that I was at. But they'd made the judgment simply by the place where I'd come from. I'd come from Africa. I was African, therefore it was an automatic, placement into this English group without ever even investigating whether the country that I'd come from, whether they spoke English.
Right.
And those kinds of assumptions and stereotypes, unfortunately, I felt like ever since then I've had to deal with either on a daily basis and unfortunately in almost every aspect of life that I've had in Australia.
And you also, when you came here, you would have been living in blocks of flats, or that'd be unfamiliar from your Zambian experience?
Look, yes, the environment in which, one of the biggest changes was also the environment and food. I remember living in a house in Zambia. It wasn't the biggest house, but it was a house. But it was also open. It meant that I could wander off to the next door neighbours. I knew who all the kids in the neighbourhood were. I would play with them before school or after school, whichever it was. Coming here, we then, once my parents found a job, they got an apartment in Melbourne. That apartment was, not only was it obviously small, but it felt like living in a box. All of a sudden, I went from being able to play wherever I wanted to play to being confined after school to basically being indoors. Automatically, I became more sedentary than active.
Yes.
And a lot of the activities that I would have done, like come home, go and pick mulberries off a fruit tree or guavas or things like that, were all cut off.
Yes.
And socially as well, I didn't know who my neighbours were. And the neighbours didn't even have any kids. If they had any, we'd never seen them before. So it meant that I didn't actually get to play with other kids because the kids at school wouldn't invite me to their houses because I was different. I had to wait until an opportunity arose with my parents' friends who were of similar backgrounds to socialise, and that might be once a week or maybe once a month. We relied on parties, social gatherings, Every time an African would come but at that time the African population was so small that every time someone new would come, everyone would know about it. Yes. Everyone would gather and they'd throw a party to welcome them into the community.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how I met a lot of, the kids around my age group.
So it was very cohesive African group.
Yeah, at the time it was very cohesive African group, and I kept in contact, I know most of the people that I knew when I first came here 27 years ago, and I referred to them all as aunties and uncles, and we've literally grown up together.
Well, we're actually running towards the end of time, so in conversation you mentioned one thing which you probably will never be forgiven for. You don't like Vegemite.
Yes. I don't like Vegemite, yes. The shock of tasting Vegemite for the first time, I'll never forget it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, thank you so much, Vissolela. And if we get the opportunity, I'd very much like to speak to you again to explore more about what it means to be a young African in Australia.
Thank you very much, Tom.
We'll be back next week.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.